Okay, so let's make a quick start with regards to what we are looking at doing. In terms of, the unit, which is management of human resources. So let's make a quick start with regard. So what we're going to do is essentially look at starting this new unit today. And this new unit is basically, I think, the last unit that you're looking at covering, which is management of human resources, 20 credits. And obviously, this unit has got 4 learning outcomes. We're looking at covering this in about 5 lectures. Today's, main discussion is going to be on an introduction to HR. And also, we'll be looking at covering learning outcome 1. So what I'm going to do is look at starting with a bit of an introduction to HR and, discuss why HRM is important, and what is the history of human resource management in general. So when we talk about, human resources management in general, what we're looking at is talking about the discipline as a whole, which essentially originated in the early or towards the end of 19th century. I would say early, late 19th century and late 18th century and early 19th century. Now, we do see the developments of HR, being staggered across 3 different, time frames. So when we look at how it originated, we primarily see the origins coming in 19th century, because after World War II, what we do see is that a lot of people started to work in rebuilding, and obviously we've started to work in factories. So if you have to look at ancient times in terms of, this particular discipline, we also see that the roots of, obviously this particular, discipline or subject is essentially also seen in ancient civilizations, and obviously how people used to effectively look at organizing and managing, various resources. And when we talk about various resources, here we are talking about human resources. The modern concept of HRM began, I would say, in the 19th century. Now, the main workings of the human resources and the human relations essentially started, when we started to see people start, working in factories. And that happened as late as, or as early as, 1830s, when factories started to come up and a lot of, male workers essentially started to be employed in factories. There were changes introduced in terms of, legislation globally. And what we do get to see is that there was a bit of a regulation done on how many hours children and women could work within factories during that point in time. And then we see the onset of trade unions and other, aspects of unionization and, relations within how human resources are managed, started off, in the early 19th century. But we do see the development of this structured discipline coming across when a few chartered bodies and, some work which was presented by the Chartered Institute of Professional Development, was put forward in the 1913. And we saw that some of the clear activities of what this particular department does, or were at least, published, were including things like recruitment and selection. We look at industrial relations. There was inclusion of legislation and follow up on the legislation. And these bits is what we saw, as major milestones that we see in terms of, the beginnings of human resource development. Now, there's a very good, let's say there were a number of experiments which were essentially done by Frederick Taylor. And when we look at Frederick Taylor's experiment, he's also called the father of scientific management. And what we do see is that he played a very significant role in the development of what is called the personal development or personal function within companies. And he came across with a scientific experiment, which was Hawthorne studies, which was conducted between 1920s and 1930s. And this particular experiment at Western Electric as a company, sparked the emphasis on that we need to look into social and welfare aspect of workers working within factories. And interpretation of this study, across a spectrum of people who have done has led to the, I would say, in one way or the other, let's say the evolution of human resources management as a discipline. Now, the whole philosophy of human relations and labor relations, or essentially, as we say, management of human resources is dominantly concentrated between the 1940s and 50s. And what we see is that in 1960s, this was revolutionized by the passing of various bills and legislations across many different countries. And what we do get to see is that that is where this particular discipline essentially got established more or less as a separate function within an organization. So you had marketing, you had finance, you had business development, you had engineering, production, and HR also became an important function as far as the subject or discipline is concerned. Now, what we are going to do is obviously see the details of how we see the origins of human resources management as a function happening, and it is discussed by various many authors, psychologists, and scientists. And we do get to see that this particular discipline is about 75 years or more. Sometimes if we include the early 19th century, then we can also say that this is just over 100 years old. But if I see the core, as I mentioned, the core origins of this particular discipline, we see this in the last 40s and 50s, and from then on, this has become what is called an established, let's say, function within all organizations. Now, today's activities, if I look at in HR, typically include things like dealing with diversity or diverse professionals that work within an organization. You look at rewards, including compensation, benefits, and pensions. You look at resourcing side of things, which is a more bigger term than recruitment and selection, because resourcing will also include things like recruitment, disciplinary action, and also redundancy. Not just recruiting, but also layoffs and redundancies. And then we look at one of the key functions which has developed over the years is employee relations. That means which is related to performance management and absenteeism or absence management within organization. Learning and development or training and development has also been added as a bit to this particular function, and this tends to be important because simply because of the fact that most employees and resources, when they join the organization, at some stage you need to look at upskilling, reskilling, or when performance appraisals happen at the end of the year, we do get to see that we are having to put people into training and development, and this training and development essentially tends to be related to the aspect of helping the employees do their role effectively. And then we look at a lot of policies and procedures which primarily are implemented, created, and then implemented and monitored by the human resources manager or the team, essentially, if it's a bigger organization. And this tends to be looking at systems, processes, and policies which employees and most of the staff follow in carrying out their day-to-day activities. So this particular unit will encompass all the HR side of activities that we are going to discuss, and a brief history in terms of what is HRM and how HR as a profession or as a field originated. I'm going to provide a handout which basically talks about the evolution in history of human resources management. And that particular handout, which you look at, would essentially give you a good, thorough understanding of how do we see this particular, field essentially changing over the years, and how this is going to help adapt, or deal with, let's say, human resources side of problems and things within the organization. And that is going to be useful just to get some history, and I would put it this way, a background into this particular discipline, if this is of interest to you. Obviously, when we look at talking about with regards to this particular profession, there are lots and lots of things that we can go through and understand. But generally speaking, when we talk about the various aspects and areas of how HRM originated and where it came from, it'll be the Frederick Taylor's experiment or the scientific experiments that we talk about, which is where we see the origins of how the role of HR essentially started to happen, or was recognized initially as a discipline, and the need for this particular role was felt. And that allowed the development of, I would say, human resources management as a function to happen within, various parts of the organization. And as the discipline and subject has really grown, what we've generally seen is that, over the years, companies have evolved and put together or put into practice a lot of things which generally, are, let's put it this way, important for the growth of the organization, because this function essentially looks at managing the role of human resources. And when we talk about the management of human resources, what we do see is that this has become a key aspect, because this resource can actually control any other type of resource that we talk about. So from what we see is that management of human resources has become very important in, I would say, services related organization, or in the gig economy in particular, because of the fact that people are able to drive most of the roles and responsibilities, like, for example, controlling finances, directing or using equipment, using some of the other resources, which could be administrative, financial, or, infrastructural resources. And that is why companies like Facebook, LinkedIn, Microsoft, you look at Apple, a lot of these global companies today pay a lot of emphasis. Google itself play a lot of emphasis on management of human resources. So during COVID, if you recall, a lot of these companies continued operations because they took or made major changes in their policy with regards to ensuring that people could actually work from home. Banking industry in particular adapted quite quickly because of the fact that they had to continue these services. So call center services or taking calls was then possible by members of the staff at most banks when the calls were being rerouted to their home. So adaptations using technology was done. Companies like Google, Apple, some of the other companies also, provided $1,000, $2,000 allowances to employees to be able to buy a work desk or provide a PC or a laptop or a Mac to be able to effectively work from home. And these are changes which had happened at the, let's say, peak of the pandemic, because most companies wanted their employees to continue working, but although be it from home. And this flexibility of working was introduced with the help of the HR, side of things within most organizations, wherein the management or the, HR department had a consultation to say, if this is going to continue, how do we look at, organizing our resources and obviously making sure work is not hampered. And in those cases, these companies called up, essentially called up, when I say is basically took a decision to make these provisions available. And that is where we see, this discipline allowing the companies to continue working during even the pandemic. So this particular handout that I'm going to provide basically gives you a very good idea of how the evolution and, the evolution of human resources, as a function. But at the same time, this also would provide you details into how we see this function shaping up in the coming years, as far as, the subject area and the discipline is concerned. Now, with this particular background, what I want to do is basically go into some of the details of what we are going to be covering in this particular unit. So this particular unit, we are going to look at today the first learning outcome. And the first learning outcome is talking about knowing the purpose and the objective of human resource management. There are obviously 3 assessment criteria here, which talk about how human resource management evolved. So this handout would come in handy. Purpose of human resource management and the objectives of human resource management. So 3 key terms is what we are looking at doing here today in terms of study, which is to understand purpose, objective, and the history. So history part of it, what I would do is essentially ask you to go through that particular handout, which I'm going to make available on Moodle. There's a video that I'm also going to play, which is basically going to give us a bit of a background about what is HRM, in a snapshot. And that is what we'll discuss, start our discussions with. And then we'll go into the key functions of HR and also relate it to some 1 or 2 practical examples in terms of how do we see HR and HR function playing out on a daily basis within an organization or business, or, let's say any such organization which has a number of people working within their business or their functions. And we'll be looking at covering these three different assessment criteria as we go along in our discussions. So any questions on this so far, you can ask me through the chat route. You can ask me by unmuting yourself on the microphone as well. So this is the presentation which I'm going to make available just after the session on Moodle, and this will be covering learning outcome 1. Now, very briefly, I think, although we understand why we are looking at studying this unit, but as you're studying level 5 within tourism and hospitality management, one of the key units that you have is the human resource management, is because you want to understand how HR works and what is HR in general, how it works, and what are the key objectives and functions this particular discipline actually performs or helps perform within the organization or a particular business or a particular branch of a business. Now, we are going to be focused on studying and understanding the business functions of HR and how they help in looking at performance management and employee welfare within the organization of staff and employees, contractors, suppliers who are contributing to the achievement of the aims and objective of the organization. One of the key things that you're going to be also learning is some of the theories, and these theories will be related to let's say the origins of HRM, the various HR models that we talk about, in terms of usage within the organization. And when we talk about these various, models of HRM, there are 5 in general, which are very broadly accepted. And, they are now very clearly established and as a function in terms of how do we manage human resources, department within an organization. So we'll be briefly looking at this particular aspect of the theory as well, which includes models like the Harvard framework of HRM. It'll also include the David Ulrich HR model, the 8-box model of Paul Basile, and we'll also look at the Warwick model, and the 5P model, which are the established models of HRM that we do get to see that people working within this role actually use and employ in creating systems, policies, and procedures within an organization. There are lots of other models as well, like the 5C model of HRM, which basically include things like engaging employees, caring for them, like care, connect, coach, contribute, and congratulate. And then there are other models which have also originated originally from the Harvard framework of HRM, and they include the guest model, the HR value chain model, and the standard casual model of HRM. There are obviously contemporary models which have also come up over the years, and the modern aspect of some of these models are actually used by HR managers, strategy officers, or chief let's say human resources officers, in order to create strategy and systems, policies, and processes within the organization. Now, these models, the understanding of these frameworks will be useful for you to understand how you can put them into practice within a particular setup. And that is one of the goals of what we are going to look at. How do you look at designing and implementing effective HR strategies? And these models would be, contributing to help you understand how these strategies can be aligned to organizational goals, and how can we ensure that they are strategies which are going to be creating efficient management of human resources within the organization. Now, let's watch a particular video that we want to look at in general. And this would be a video that talks about what is generally HRM. A very short video which basically emphasizes the importance of HRM within the organization. So let me play this video.
You know what HR is, but do you know what exactly HR does? Human resource management, often shortened to HRM or HR, is the practice of recruiting, hiring, deploying, and managing an organization's employees. A company's HR department acts as a bridge between a company and its employees, facilitating a healthy relationship between employees and upper management, and it creates and implements policies to help everyone do their jobs. There are 4 kinds of HRM objectives. Societal objectives aim to meet the ethical and social needs of the company, addressing issues like equal opportunity and pay. Organizational objectives strive for efficiency, including employee hiring, training, and retention. Functional objectives focus on ensuring all of HR's resources are allocated to its full potential. And finally, personal objectives seek to support the personal goals of each employee, like offering education or career development opportunity. Almost all areas of HRM have software that automates HR processes. Recruiting in particular has seen an enormous growth in software platforms and systems that match candidates with employers and then manage the rest of the hiring process. Other services offered by HRM software vendors include payroll, administration, and employee records services. Smaller companies often opt for affordable, low-maintenance, cloud-based HR systems. Larger businesses, on the other hand, tend to prefer in-house HR systems, which allow for more control. Aside from the technical responsibilities, HRM reinforces office culture and helps keep employees happy. They say a company is only as good as its employees, which makes HRM an essential part of maintaining a successful business. What HR software does your company use? Let us know in the comments and be sure to give this video a like.
Sorry. So basically, the main aspects of what HR essentially does and accomplishes within organization is encompassed in this particular short video. Now, there are lots of things which have happened over the years, and obviously as this function has got established, what we do see is a lot of companies are now also employing specialist HR software, which is softwares like, Bright HR, or there are lots of different, HR softwares which are available, which allow you, Orange HRM, for example, which essentially allow you to, manage the basic requirements of, managing your resources within the organization. And these softwares essentially do lots of different types of things or functions, and they include, say, for example, looking at performance management, looking at reviews, looking at recruitment selection, looking at acting as a repository, to be able to look at what employees have provided or have gone through the process during recruitment and selection. They will also be looking at payroll in certain instances. And we also look at this software then doing the leave management or absence management side of things in terms of automating some of these functions, which these softwares essentially help do. Excuse me. So when we look at lots of things, because in large organizations, when you talk about different types of organizations, you would generally see, depending on the number of employees working within the organization, you would essentially have, some part of this process as manual. But assuming if you're a micro business between 1 to 10 employees, it could be that they are managing the HR side of function in terms of payroll, training and development, employee relation, contracts, maybe through a software or even done manually. But when you look at small, medium enterprises, wherein small, medium businesses, essentially, which is between 10 to 50 employees, you would need to have some sort of a software which will allow you to do some of these functions and automate them. And then when you look at small, medium enterprises, anything like 51 employees to 250 employees, you definitely need, legal side of things, software side of things, and also professional management of employee records because of data protection, issues and compliance. And that is where most companies at that level would start employing a professional software, which will allow them to automate some of the usual or day-to-day activities, within this particular field. Now, any such organization bigger than that would typically have, maybe enterprise resource planning software or some of the other type of softwares which allow integration or closer integration with regards to, having closer integration with other departments, essentially, and they would be a part and parcel of that particular software. Just to show you one or two that I've opened up right now on Google. So Access PR or People PR HR essentially is one of the softwares which is used by lots of companies, quite popular. We have Persio, which is another particular software which allows you to manage, basically employee data, things like approval process, looking at performance management, reward management, leave management, and recruiting and payroll, which could be managed through this. And then you have some of the other softwares, your companies like Breathe HR or Peninsula in the UK in particular. And these companies not just offer legal services, not just the software, but also provide a fuller dashboard in terms of various products and features that can be used by HR managers in department, essentially to manage the employee database, or the activities and functions of human resources management within an organization. Now, in terms of key terminology, what I've done is I put this particular slide on, which essentially shows what are the key objectives of HRM, just as an overarching view. Key objectives typically include, meeting personal objectives, looking at, functional objectives, organizational objectives, and societal objectives. So when we look at some of these, when we talk about some of these objectives, what we are looking at is essentially understanding how we can, look at, in particular, talking about the various functions which HR actually performs. So some part of this was alluded into the video that I just played, and this explained what are the key areas in which the HR function would typically work. Now, just very briefly, we also want to look at, I've talked about this in a bit more detail earlier. So when we talk about the history of HRM, what I've done is I've created a bit of a slide here, but this slide is going to be, let's say, elaborated with that 3-page handout that I'm talking, and that would allow you to essentially, go through some of the bits with regards to, understanding the history and evolution of the HR function. Now, with this, what we want to do is, after a bit of an understanding on the history and evolution of HR, the key functions of HR, what I also want to do is talk about, some of the key functions that we look at. So key functions of HR in HR department. Can you think of some of the functions which, most HR managers do within the organization? Any idea? You want to make some guesses, educated guesses in terms of what could be the key functions which most HR departments do within the organization? So if I were to, show you, say, for example, a particular screenshot, that would basically give you a snapshot of what are the various functions that we think, are going to be something which most organizations look at from their departments. So if I look at this particular image that I've put in, these are the key functions which HR department or people working within HR do. Now, what are the various types of roles the HR, could be performing? So if I put it this way, that, when we talk about HR, what are the various, roles of HR that a person could perform when you say that I work within the HR department? So if I put it this way, in terms of the various roles, what we are looking at is there are various different types of roles which will come up within the HR department, and these would typically, be the key functions which, say, for example, most, people would take up if they look at, planning or basically taking up a career within HR. So one part of that role could be an HR officer. Then you could be a recruitment specialist. Within HR, you are a recruitment specialist or a recruiter. You could be a training and development manager in HR role. So this could be, you could be a payroll manager. You could be somebody who's essentially looking at talent acquisition. That means you are going to be working strategically to recruit people at the senior position, management position, or, when we talk about vice president, general manager, director, chief executive, you are also looking at managing, say, for example, unions. So you are a relations officer or union relations officer, essentially. Now, these are some of the functions that, you could expect if you take up HR as a profession or as a career, that you'd be looking at essentially doing within the organization. Now, There could be also different types of roles. I've just listed down a few, which primarily could be, roles which people are, more aware of. And in this case, what you could look at and basically see is that these roles are general roles that normally people would have depending on the size and scale of the organization. You could also be working towards in legal and compliance. So, for example, acts, policies, regulation which HR needs to follow, like for example the minimum work directive, looking at minimum wages in the UK in particular, and in European Union and in the US. So for example, when you employ somebody, you have to basically, you can't pay anything lower than the minimum wage which has been put into as an act by the minimum wage act by the government of UK and other governments across the world. So depending on the area that you work in or you specialize in, you could also be looking at taking up this specific payroll or specific role within the HR, and this could be even an HR person looking after the payrolls and pay slips and payments and coordinating that with the finance department. And you could also be generally somebody who's an HR officer working in an organization which is small organizations, and here these are the kind of key functions which we generally see that people who decide to take up HR as a career would be working towards and working within the organization. So this is basically a bit of a snapshot just to look at what is HRM, the history of HRM, what are the various objectives of HRM, and what are the key functions of HRM that we need to be aware of, obviously briefly at this stage, because each of these functions can be specialist functions and there's a lot more which is involved as we look at the size and scale of the organization. And if it's a big organization, you generally see a full-fledged department, and in that department you could have a number of employees working within the HR roles, and these could be some of the roles that they could be working in. So when I talk about, say, for example, compensation and benefits, one of the key things that you will see in compensation and benefits could be things like rewards, pensions, recognition, work-life development, or work-life balance kind of things. They could also look at somebody looking at working towards employee rewards. Sometimes some organizations also have what are called, let's say, packages which they provide to employees, things like dental and annual dental insurance, like a gym membership. So all those things are a part and parcel of, some of these functions, and they would be specialist functions when we look at any particular organization. Now, with this, let's get into some of the assessment criteria in terms of what HR, what are the assessment criteria for learning outcome 1 in particular. Now, the first assessment criteria talks about explain how human resources management as a function evolved. Now, what we do see is that the evolution of HR, essentially happened in the last, I would say 125 years. And we see the origins of this happening with the, Frederick Taylor's experiment that he did, the scientific experiment in the early 19th century. And that is where we see, let's say the origins of this particular subject or a discipline essentially happening. So we basically would divide this history into 3 or 4 parts. One is we look at the pre-20th century, and in which what we see is the nascent form of this function being recognized as generally related to payroll and labor relations when people started to work within factories because of the industrialization in the mid-1800th century. And what we see is that managing employees became an important aspect from a point of view of various experiments and scientific experiments which were conducted, and that started to give way to the development of this function in the early 20th century. Then we see the human relations movement happening. The Hawthorne studies that was carried out in Western Electrics, and these studies, were carried out by different people. It basically conducted studies that if you put men and women together within factories, does the efficiency increase? Does the do the people or labor working within factories feel more comfortable? Lighting conditions, conditions related to how the conditions are within the factory in terms of temperature, lighting, ventilation, and things like that. and were they effective? So Hawthorne studies in particular did experimentation on lighting studies. So if they put people in working conditions wherein the facilities were having good lighting, then productivity was generally seen as increasing, and people were generally more happy. And is what led to the the development of I would say the human resources function at that point in time, wherein the employees were then treated as one of the assets within the organization, and one of the clear approach was to look at dealing with social and psychological factors to improve the well-being of the employees working within these factories. In the 50s and 60s, we see this approach wherein the focus shifted from social and psychological factors and welfare to primarily administrative functions, and from the administrative to the strategic ones, which is related to theories introduced by McGregor, which is theory X and Y. And that is where we see the involvement of, with this particular theory. When we look at certain motivational theories, there are lots of motivational theories. So one of the clear things which was associated with human resources was that motivation tends to be an important factor of why people work and would want to work and get paid for work. So McGregor, Mayo, and a lot of other scientists conducted various types of experiments. McGregor's theory of X and Y, wherein he proposed two factors, which basically talk about that individuals inherently dislike work and will avoid the work as much as possible. And the Y factor said people do not, they are not lazy. They are capable of self-motivation and they are interested in working. But obviously conditions have to be conducive for them to be able to work and, produce, output which is desired by the employer. So this theory was quite influential in shaping the managerial practices and understanding on how different management styles within organization can lead or have an impact on motivation, performance of the employees. So McGregor's theory essentially is contributed, credited, with laying down the foundation for further research in the study of organizational behavior and for management theory in terms of understanding human relations or human resources in general. And this theory clearly emphasized that there is importance which need to be paid or put on considering employees, their attitudes, their welfare, and their needs in the workplace, which allows the organization finally to achieve its objectives. Then we look at the 1980s, and in the 1980s, the key based, let's put it this way, the key focus moved to resource-based view, which was proposed by Barney. And here, the focus turned to aligning HR and HR practices with the strategic goals of the organization, and how can HR essentially help in achieving these goals and objectives by recruiting the right people with the right mindset, the right attitudes, people who are motivated and willing to work within the organization to achieve those objectives. And that is where this particular view of aligning the HR function with the strategic goals of the organization led to the creation of, or led to the coining of the term strategic HRM. That means we are looking at aligning or planning essentially things for a longer term perspective of the organization. And in this long-term perspective or long-term goals, we look at the activities which HR does or performs being strategic. And that is where we see this bit, coming up. And then we talk about the development of contemporary issues in HRM or contemporary HRM essentially. And when we talk about contemporary HRM, what we are essentially looking at is, the two things that you need to understand. So when we talk about contemporary, which means something which is ongoing, which is occurring, which is now relevant in the present times. So when we talk about contemporary HRM, what we are talking about is basically issues which are related to the current trends and climates and the current period in which we are, working. So here, there was a further development of the HRM function in the 21st century, wherein contemporary HRM was included. And this basically has been this has evolved from the strategic function of HRM or HRM in general, wherein because now companies are, companies or businesses have global, let's say, because of let me rephrase that by saying, because of the advent of globalization, wherein the businesses can operate now beyond boundaries, a lot of companies essentially need to work with and hire people in different countries and different places. And this tends to be a case in point wherein they have to employ local and hire local resources, which has led to the creation of cultural diversity within organization. And diversity and, various, let's say, let me put it this way, diversity and also the need for organizations to be able to adapt to local conditions and locations where they operate has led to the rise of the understanding and recognizing what is called contemporary HRM. Now, this particular era, what we call, is also because HR faces a lot of challenges in this particular era. Things like your job design and analysis or job descriptions have to be tailored. You are looking at workforce planning. You're looking at training and development as an essential function, because you can't, if I go back 50 years, if people were not motivated, not working properly, I could make them redundant and hire a new resource. But today, the practices of hiring and firing can be compliance related, can be very tedious, can be very expensive for the organization. So here, the role is to focus on training and development to increase the efficiency and productivity of the resource within the organization, to keep them motivated, by looking at their compensation and benefits. And this is where the contemporary version or the contemporary HRM has become critical in today's business landscape. And there are challenges which businesses and organizations face because of the evolving nature of how the companies work in a globalized economy, and because of which what we then see is the rise of contemporary HRM happening within the 21st century. Now, in this particular concept, we essentially see the Ulrich model of HR becoming quite predominant as far as helping in shaping the organizational strategy and then helping the organization to introduce change within the organization. So when we talk about the HR business partner model, which is what Ulrich's model is, David Ulrich, which basically explained and came up with this particular model, his model is often associated with addressing the evolving nature of HR requirements or business requirements over a period of time, and how HR as a function needs to adjust to these ever-changing needs of the business requirement. And this is what he outlined in his particular model, that the strategic role of HR and HR professionals within an organization can be managed by studying 4 aspects. And that is what his model talks about. So I'm going to circulate a handout specifically, which will cover these 4 models. But the Ulrich model talks about these 4 key roles which HR plays within the changing with the changing needs of the business organization. They tend to be that the HR person has to function and work as a strategic partner to manage some of the HR practices and keep changing and aligning the goals of the HR employees with the strategy and the long-term vision of the organization. The HR person also needs to act as a change agent. So this is again a major point, that HR function is not a passive function within the organization, and HR plays an active role. And in this role, they have to act as a change agent within the organization. They also act as an administrative expert. That means they are very fluent and well-versed with system policies and processes and are compliant with them, so that if they need to action or use some of them, they know how they can be implementing these systems, policies, and procedures within the organization. And the last function which he focused on was that they have to be an employee champion. That means they have to be an advocate of the employees. They need to be able to understand their needs and wants and how best to take care of the well-being of the employees within the organization, so that they feel that they are engaged, they are also being developed, there is a sense of satisfaction, and a positive workforce culture can be maintained. And these are the four key roles he came up with, which are very well recognized in the David Ulrich's model introduced in 1997. And it helps the organization align its strategies with long-term vision, specifically related to the areas of managing talent, that means managing resources, and inclusion and diversity with the integration of technology within the organization. So when we talk about, various things in regards to the evolution of human resources management as a function, what we are talking about is that it started off as an administrative function, but over the years, and as it has developed, we see that it has become a strategic function in most organizations. And there are many frameworks that we need to understand with regards to the evolution, and where some of these models and frameworks became important, and how they defined the role of HR and the functions of HR within an organization is something that we need to be able to understand in the history and evolution of HR as a function by reading the assessment criteria 1.1. So I'm going to circulate a bit of a handout which will include the history of HRM, but also will include the key frameworks that we talk about in general, which have shaped up let's say the thinking behind how the evolution of the HR function has essentially happened over the last few decades. Now, any questions on this discussion so far with regards to assessment criteria 1.1? Any questions? Okay, let's look at assessment criteria 1.2. Now, 1.2 assessment criteria talks about the purpose of human resource management. The key word here is we need to understand, what does HR do? What is the key question that we need to look at when we talk about the function of HR? So when we talk about addressing the question of human resource management, we need to clearly understand the theoretical concepts and framework around how the organization essentially works, and why do we need HR as a function at all, as far as the business model is concerned. This is something that we need to clearly understand with regards to the assessment criteria 1.2. So the first one that we will look at would be the research based view. And this research based view that we talk about is a strategic framework which was introduced by Barney in 1991. Now, this framework talks about the purpose of HRM and how it helps in acquiring, developing, and deploying human resources for the organization, but not in general, but to gain a competitive edge as far as the human resources are concerned. So sometimes, if I put this through an example, that sometimes when organizations look at hiring people, why do they look at hiring the best possible talent for that particular role? Now, if an organization is looking at achieving sales goals, they would try and hire the best possible sales manager from the market, or person who has a number of years of experience or has been performing that role for a competitor or a different organization, and knows when they hire him, even if they pay him the amount or the compensation that the person wants, they know that they are going to be banking on something wherein the organization would be essentially achieving, its particular role or objective of achieving the goal of achieving the target at the end of the year. So when we talk about, these aspects, what we are essentially talking about is basically looking at hiring the best possible talent, which will give the company the competitive edge over its competitors. So the resource-based view that we talk about in HRM is essentially focused on understanding how can the HR help us recruit the best possible talent, develop it, and then deploy it in a way which will allow the the company to achieve its say for example the objectives at the end of the year. Now, if sometimes we feel that, the recruitment has not gone, as per plan, then in some cases you also see that there is a probation period or a trial period which is built into the contracts, and that allows the organization and the candidate to, part ways because the performance is not coming to the expectation of the organization. Now, the second theory that we look at is primarily the Fiedler's contingency theory. Now, Fiedler's contingency theory, he introduced this theory in the 1960s, to be precise, 1967. And he is, his theory is prominent because it talks about leadership and what leadership, provides as an emphasis in terms of the style of the leader and how does it help the leader, deal and, let's say, manage his employees within the organization. Now, this theory of Fiedler, which is the contingency theory, talks about categorizing the leadership into two different styles: task-focused and relationship-focused. So what he proposed as an idea was that when leaders focus on tasks, they are more concerned about achieving the objectives. They would basically, let's say, overlook relationships with their employees and their priorities in terms of their welfare. And that would mean that in some cases, you would generally see more redundancies or more turnover in terms of employees within the organization because the leader is more focused on achieving the goals and objectives that are set rather than the well-being of the individual. Then he introduced what is called situational factors. Now, the situational factors were that if leadership it has to be effective, it needs to be looking at a match between the leadership style and the situational factors within the organization. And these could be the task structure, the relations with the team, and what is the power position of the leader. So in this case, if they are balanced, that would lead to a positive outcome because employees would be loyal, they would be performing and effective and productive in their roles, and the leader and the leadership style would be, let's say, positive, having a positive effect on the organization because there is a match between what the leader is proposing, how it is done, and looking at also the factors which are important for the employees or situational factors which are basically going to be important for the employees for their well-being and for also to be able to achieve the objectives. So when we talk about this theory in general, what we are looking at is his proposition of that the leadership, if it's only task focus, then you need to have a very highly structured organization and an environment wherein most of the deliverables are available for the employees to be able to perform their role, and this would then lead to an effective and a productive organization. Now, in practical terms, when we talk about, these are the two theoretical frameworks that we need to know when we talk about the purpose of HRM. So purpose of HRM, resource-based view, wherein we are looking at focusing on, how do we acquire, develop, and deploy human resources in a manner which would provide competitive advantage to an organization. And the contingency theory, wherein it is talking about leadership style and relationship or task-based leadership styles being focused on, task-focused or relationship-focused, and depending on how they are deployed within the organization, that would allow the staff to achieve and help in the achievement of these goals and objectives within the organization. Now, what do we see is the purpose of HRM? What are the key functions which HR does? Key functions of HR, if I have to put it, and if I have to look at maybe showing you an image, which basically, let's say, summarizes some of these functions in an overview, rather than going into a lot of details. What I would do is primarily put together an image which would, be something like this. So if I get a better resolution image, let's put it this way. That would be just looking at a particular bit. So if I look at the main functions of what HR does, this is what it would summarize, or I would say this is what it would be looking at, summarizing in general. So when we talk about 7 or 8 functions of HR, if I again look at, let me see if I can bring a better image in. Yeah, this is a much better image. So if I look at the 7 or 8 key functions of HR that we normally would want to, talk about, that people do within the organization, these would be the basic functions that we are going to discuss in terms of the purpose of HR. What are the various functions which HR does, and that gives us the purpose of HRM. So the first function that we talk about is recruitment and selection. Second, we talk about is training and development. Then we talk about performance management. We talk about compensation and benefits. We talk about employee relations in general. And then we also talk about data and analytics, and also talk about succession planning. And these would be dependent on how big the organization is, what the scale of the organization is, and how it does work, and how many employees are there, and what kind of an organization structure is there, and that would kind of tell us what are the various different functions within the organization. So I briefly summarize them here. Now, recruitment and selection, quite clear. We are looking at creating a job description, a job advert, looking at doing interviews, shortlisting them, issue of contracts. Selection process would involve interviews. Maybe in some cases, some organizations, if you are in Facebook or if you're applying to a software company, they might ask you to do a test or put up an example of coding. And that would basically be looking at checking their skills. And that would essentially be, the process through which you're going to look at shortlisting and taking on candidates for the purposes of, hiring them in a particular role. So in general, when we talk about, recruitment and selection, we are very clear that is to recruit and, select the best possible talent within the organization. And that is one of the key functions that you would generally see that the, HR would do. Then we look at functions like training and development. So sometimes, if you look at the example of NHS in the UK, you generally see that nurses, doctors, health and social care workers, or if you look at the hotel and travel industry in general, a lot of emphasis is paid on training and development in order to young people and then train them to work within various departments within the organization, whether it's laundrette, whether it's restaurant, front desk, finance, HR, events, in general, they would be trained by the organization, and training would be an important function. Managing their performance, compensation, and benefits are other functions which HR would do. And then maintaining relationships, understanding the requirements of human resources, looking after their well-being is an important function, and that would be something also a part and parcel of the purpose of HR. So when we look at various functions of HR, they are going to be essential in ensuring that an organization's workforce is managed effectively and efficiently in terms of aligning them with the objectives that the organization needs to achieve. And these would be the practical functions of human resources manager or anybody who works within human resources department. Is that okay? Any questions on this? Okay, let's go across to the last assessment criteria, which is talking about explaining the objectives of human resource management. Now, in order to look at the objectives of human resource management, what we need to do is go into some of the detailing of the functions of HRM. So when we talk about, the objectives of, explaining the objectives of HRM, what we are looking at is going into individual functions like what is staffing and recruitment? What is the purpose of, say, for example, let's say, performance management or training and development? And this is what will allow us to understand what is the key role and, objective of each of these functions within the organization. So when we do talk about, the various functions, what we are looking at is, if I talk about, say, staffing and recruitment, one of the things, if I look at this way, that within the hotel, generally you have lots of staff which keep, sometimes they keep leaving and they keep, joining, or if there are people which are being recruited, then there is bits and pieces which the, let's say, the department has to do time and again. Now, when we talk about these particular requirements, you would generally see that in some cases, if the, let's say, if the, say, for example, the hotel, there is a new hotel, say, for example, Marriott looks at expanding. And if Marriott looks at expanding, what they need to do is, they'd say, for example, so if Marriott, for example, as a hotel, they need to expand, what you need to be able to do is essentially look at, ensuring that the hotel, when it is being built and when it is ready for operations, then in those cases, what needs to happen is that there would be, say, for example, number of employees required to work within that facility. It could be within various departments of a hotel or various functions, and that is where the recruitment side of things would need to come into place. And that would be an example that you could take for explaining staffing and recruitment. Now, you could also the other thing that you have to also look at is, if I go into some of the detailing of, say, next function, which is training and development. If you again look at here, there's an example wherein employee skills need to be sharpened or enhanced. Knowledge needs to be increased in terms of handling some of these situations. So what you will generally see is that if, say, for example, if the organization introduces a new, booking system or a software within the front desk of the hotel, then in that case, all employees who work within the front desk, check-ins and check-outs, would need to essentially be trained on that particular system. So in those cases, you would generally see that the HR department would need to put some sort of a training in place, and that training would essentially, allow employees to understand how to work with that particular software and then use it for the reasons of, checking in and checking out, let's say, various guests. And that would be, something which will be useful for example, for the purposes of, the training side of things. And that would allow the employees to use, let's say, the, the software more effectively. Say, for example, if the check-in software being used was, Cosmos, and that's an older version, and it takes a lot of time to do, check in and check out. But as the management has realized that there's a newer version available and the update needs to be applied, which has lots more functions, then in those cases, you would generally see that, what the management would do is take a decision to essentially, introduce this new software. And what they would need to do is basically then help the organization through HR train some of the employees who are going to be working on the front desk and would be using this particular software. So that would help you explain, training and development. Similarly, we can go on and discuss performance management, employee relation, compensation and benefits, and obviously legal and ethical compliance, which HR department needs to look at maintaining with regards to, say, for example, regulation, legislation, which is available in different countries in different contexts. And I've created a few slides on these, which basically allow us to understand that one of the key objectives of human resources management is to help in achieving, the organizational goals and objectives at the end of the year. That means what are the organizational goals and objectives? So these could be related to, for example, customer experience, looking at ensuring, that customers are satisfied in the hospitality and tourism industry, minimization of complaints, making sure that time management or people were coming to take up work within their shifts on time, to look at ensuring well-being, of the, for example, people working within the organization, to ensure that they are, essentially having all the resources to be able to perform, their job effectively. And this would then allow the organization at the end of the day to achieve their main objectives, which is, achieving the objectives of, keeping customers happy, keep gaining customers, increasing business, or in some cases, also looking at ensuring that there is continuity in the business, because the operations and the business are very well established. So what the company needs to then do is ensure that, the ongoing activities and operations are being performed in accordance with, the policies and processes which have been set, and thereby helping the organization achieve its objective. Now, in order to further understand and do a bit of more reading in terms of, I'm going to suggest two particular articles that you need to read. One is The New Possible, which is the McKinsey's article essentially on how HR can help build an organization of the future. This is a very good article to read, and I put a link here. And the other is, because of the history of HR that we have studied, and we talk about the origins of evolution of HRM into strategic HRM in the 1990s. What is HR strategy? There's a very good article written here on this particular site, and this is what I would suggest that you need to read in order to, let's say, understand this particular learning outcome that we have covered today in a lot more detail. Now, along with that, I'm going to also provide you two particular handouts, and these two particular handouts are going to be related to, the frameworks that I've mentioned and the history and evolution of HR as a discipline, and they would help you essentially, crystallize and understand this first learning outcome that we've discussed in as much detail as possible. Now, that brings us to the end of today's session. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask me now. Any questions that you have with regards to what we've covered today in our discussions. Any questions that you're in? That's great. No worries. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and upload these particular updates to the Moodle right now, and they would essentially help you go through this particular bit in a bit more detail, as I mentioned. And these would include the one, obviously, the handout. The two handouts in particular, and then the presentation, which is slightly updated from the time it was last, delivered. So you could refer to the updated presentation and, the evolution on history of HRM and the key frameworks. Now, I'm also going to upload a small, handout from a book, which in particular talks about, introduction to the role of HRM. And these ones in particular, I would suggest, is what you need to go through, because this will be more updated in terms of, delivery. And that would mean that you would also be looking at using this handout that I've created, or extracted from a book, for the purposes of covering learning outcome, 2 and learning outcome, 3. That we'll also study in the subsequent weeks. So let me create a bit of that differentiation, on Moodle as I'm showing you right now, and you should be able to access that pretty much, instantly just after this session. So I will see you tomorrow to discuss learning outcome 2. Until then, take care and thanks for joining, and bye for now.